Okay, hi everyone. I wanted to come back. It's been a while since I've done anything for the channel, and I thought maybe it's time to have, at the very least, another book discussion. One of the reasons for kind of the gap between content is I'm wearing multiple hats this summer. I do have my full-time job. I'm also, as you may have seen, working for the website The Clio, documenting and writing entries about historical sites. I'm focusing on the eastern part of Kansas right now, doing a section on different sites along Route 66 in Kansas. Also have two young kids, but I had some rain today, so I don't have to mow, and I decided I'm going to take a break from assembling some furniture and record my thoughts on the last book I read this summer because I really enjoyed it and I really wanted to get some thoughts down. And that book is Wolfgang. This is starting off well. The book is Wolfpack by Roger Moorhouse, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War. This is a recently published work. It tells the story of the U-Boat War from the German perspective. Now, a little bit more importantly than that, it actually tells the story about what the people in the U-boat arm went through during the course of the war. So it's not strictly about strategy and fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. It really is a story about what these, in every case, very young men went through in the course of this struggle. It also takes a look at some of the common misconceptions of the Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats and turns some of them on its head. One of the big points that it makes was, despite the stories that the Allies tell about the struggle to keep the lifeline to Europe open and winning the Battle of the Atlantic, Moorhouse makes the argument that at no point were the Germans ever close to winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and that in almost no scenario was it actually winnable to them with what they had going on. When they finally did have tools to close the technological gap the Allies had opened, it was really too little too late at that point. How this book came to my attention is I saw it in a bookstore. Why did I pick it up? Because I've had a lifelong fascination with submarines. It's hard to tell where it started. For me, when I look back, I think part of it started when I saw this movie. You see, I've got my DVD or my Blu-ray copy of the director's cut. A lot of you may be aware of this movie, Das Boot, a German film from the early 1980s. I originally saw this movie on local channel is The Boat as an English dub that I recorded on VHS. I watched that recording a lot. Once I got older, Blu-rays and DVDs came out. I managed to get my hands on original German language version with subtitles, which in my opinion is far, far superior. But this tells the story based on a novel by the same name about a war correspondent who goes on a patrol aboard a U-boat. It is based on the actual experience of the author going on a war patrol aboard a U-boat in World War II. It is a visceral look at life aboard a U-boat, the experience that this one crew goes through on this one voyage, and just periods of tedium and boredom punctuated by absolute sheer terror under the water as they are hunted basically to exhaustion. There has been a lot written about the U-boats and the Battle of the Atlantic. Another recent book that I read that I really enjoyed was U-Boat 977, the true story of the U-boat that escaped to Argentina. And this is about, at the end of the war, U-boat makes its way from Norway all the way to Argentina to surrender, thinking that they would get better treatment, they wouldn't end up in an Allied POW camp. There's actually great fears about what would happen to them and a lot of misconceptions about how the Allies treated their prisoners. But this tells the story of this crew who made this arduous voyage underwater using a snorkel, which is literally a pipe that you stick above the water to suck air in so you could run your diesel engine and throw the exhaust out. And they made their way submerged all the way across the Atlantic. And this tells the story of that. There's also fantastic reference works. Clay Blair, who was a submariner in the United States Navy during the Pacific War, wrote a very well-regarded volume about the United States submarine campaign in the Pacific called Silent Victory. He's also published a series on U-boats. This is Hitler's U-Boat War by Clay Blair. This is one volume of two. This is a 2-volume work. This is the first one, The Hunters. I have the second one as well, The Hunted. Fantastic. That relates almost every patrol of almost every boat and every ship sunk. It is incredibly, incredibly detailed, and it's a fantastic reference work. But the gap that Wolfpack really fills is the experience of these young men and these crews, telling about Germany only had about 22 submarines that they could send on patrol when the war started. Admiral Dönitz, who was head of the U-boat arm pretty much throughout the war, had wanted 300. And while eventually he does get his giant U-boat fleet, at that point the Allies, they have broken the German naval code, they have broken the naval enigma, they have made technological advances in radar, in sonar, in depth charges, new weapons to use. They have opened up a pretty severe technological gap with the Germans that they were just not able to close throughout the war. This tells a story of, it starts off with U-47, commanded by Gunter Prien, and their absolutely thrilling story of penetrating the main Royal Navy anchorage in Scapa Flow, Scotland, and sinking the battleship Royal Oak in the opening days of the war. This is just an absolutely lightning bolt at British morale at the very beginning of the war, something no one thought could be done. And these early convoy battles and these early U-boat heroes, and then they fade from the stage. And Moorhouse tells the story of sort of the 3 waves of U-boat captains. You have the ones at the beginning of the war with a lot of experience, did very, very well. And then you have the ones who grew up under those. And then you have the very last group, the younger captains that came up entirely during the war. The different ways they dealt with these things. It talks about the fight to maintain morale within the U-boat force. At one point, very few boats were coming back. A lot of boats were lost on their very first missions or their very first patrols. The young crews with limited training, there were lots of training accidents. They were rushed into combat. They already had a technological gap to fight, and it just got worse from then on. Germans, Admiral Dönitz promised his men and his U-boat arm that new technological tools were coming, brand new U-boats. They were developing some pretty revolutionary types of U-boats, actually. The Type 23 and the Type 21, which a lot of post-war designs were based on, that were going to have incredibly expanded battery capacity to allow them to run underwater at high speeds for longer periods. It has always been, as Moorhouse points out, the Achilles heel of the submarine in World War II is it's not really a submarine. It's a boat that can submerge for a little while. But at most, you have 48 hours underwater endurance at a very low speed. So it's a case of hopefully you can evade and escape in that time. If not, you have to come to the surface once your batteries are dead. And you have got to use your diesel engine to recharge that battery. And they would wait for you to come up. And that's when you try to make your getaway. Absolutely harrowing tales. It tells also the story about the families and how the German Navy would communicate. I think it's worth actually reading a passage from here that I've marked about this, because to me this really drives home Moorhouse's not only narrative strengths and the analytical work they're doing, but the point Moorhouse is trying to make about what these people went through and what was the experience like for them. And this passage, it's the end of a chapter called Lined in Black, which kind of deals with how were families and next of kin and relatives notified about what happened to their loved ones if something were to happen to their U-boat. And this particular passage tells the story of the disappearance of U-439. In this case, U-439 had gone out on patrol, and then at one point they had just lost contact with it. Very unfortunately common thing to happen at the time. Germans simply didn't know what had happened to it. Most likely it had been attacked either by an aircraft, most likely by an aircraft, or by a surface ship like a destroyer or a corvette, and it had been sunk. But many times we just don't know the details because they just lost contact and they never came back. it talks about the methodology they use to inform the families. And to me, this is very illuminating. After the U-boat disappeared and made radio contacts, it says, consequently, the first message that was sent out to the families of the crew in early June informed them of the serious concerns that the flotilla commander had for the vessel and its men. So there is a series of timed communications that would go out to prime the families for the fact that, in all likelihood, their loved one was not coming back. It says, after the passage of an appropriate time, the letter stated, it should now be assumed the submarine would not return, and U-439 and its crew were considered lost. Moorhouse goes on to say, the families were not spared the hard realities. The letter would say, quote, as so often in the U-boat war, where every boat fights alone, we do not know how and where U-49 was lost. The submarine left port and did not arrive in its area of operations. No word from it has been received. Consequently, we are unable at this time to provide any information about the fate of the brave crew. It is completely unknown. Moorhouse continues. The letter went on with no little sincerity to recognize that the next of kin now faced a most trying time, but reassured them that every effort would be made to provide clarity as soon as was possible. And it warned them against undertaking their own investigations, which, it said, would only, quote, burden their hearts unnecessarily. It closed by assuring them their relatives' personal effects, at least those few items that were in the possession of Naval Command, would be returned to them in due course. And it ended with a plaintive hope for good news. Stage 1. Now, 2 weeks later, the next letter arrived, rather more officious in tone this time, informing the families that military sources had confirmed that 17 of the crew, including all the officers, had been killed, and that 9 survivors had been taken prisoner. No information could be provided regarding the circumstances of the vessel sinking. But given that the fate of the remaining 22 crewmen was still unclear, the letter stated that there was still the possibility of good news. The agonies of the next of kin would therefore go on. Official confirmation of the deaths of the remaining crewmen would not be given until the following spring, when a third letter arrived, lined in black this time, and with a facsimile of an iron cross at its head, stating that U-439 had been confirmed as lost, and her remaining crew members had been declared dead. It went on to assure the next of kin of the heartfelt sympathy of the flotilla for their loss, and it praised the deceased for the loyal discharge of his duties, and for giving his life, quote, for the Führer, the people, and the fatherland. With that, the family was then free to make all the usual commemorations of the death. Black-line death notices would appear in the newspapers, and death cards would be distributed in the local church, often bearing an image of the deceased in happier times, with the request for the congregation's prayers. In time, the personal effects of the deceased would also appear in a package marked Fallen for Greater Germany. A few books, perhaps, maybe a Bible, just the items that had been left at the base before departing on patrol. 4 months later, more than a year after U-439 had been sunk, a death certificate was finally issued, confirming the name and date of birth of the deceased and giving the cause of death simply as im Atlantik gefallen, died in the Atlantic. For many of the parents, wives, and loved ones of the lost, that was all they would ever have. Some estimates show that the U-boat arm may have suffered as many as 75% casualties during the war. In other words, during the 6 years they fought the Battle of the Atlantic, 40,000 men sailed for the U-boat arm. 30,000 of them didn't return from their patrols. This book tells the story of what they went through. It is a fantastic single-volume, narrative-structured story of the U-boat war and the battle for the Atlantic. And it argues quite convincingly that the Germans were never close to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Even at the height of their success, they were not sinking enough ships to starve Britain into submission. And at no point were they able to win this war. But they continued to throw men and resources and material at an increasingly lost cause They attempted to close a technological gap that was opening too rapidly for them to cope with. And it simply, at the end, while they admitted defeat, they also admitted to themselves that they couldn't simply stop and give up. They had to keep fighting to, in this case, the very bitter end, which a lot, unfortunately, of these young men were convinced to do by this regime. It's a fantastic book. It's available in your local bookseller. I strongly recommend it. It is a very good read, very narrative, personality-based, so you're not going to get bogged down in submarine minutia and tonnages and too much broad strategy, but it really uses the lives of these men aboard these boats to tell the story of the broader war, and I think it does so very, very well. Highly recommended. As far as what to review next, I'm not sure. I'm considering a couple different topics. I'm even considering possibly some new historic fiction. So we'll see where it goes and where my summer reading takes me. As always, please like and subscribe. I do have more content coming this summer. And I might even do some related to some of the historic sites that I'm working on, writing entries for the Clio. So stay tuned for that as well. As always, thank you all for watching. Feel free to leave a comment if there's a book that you're interested in that you would like to talk about. Thank you all for being here, and have a fantastic summer.